The dust from her father's funeral had barely settled when Clara Bennett discovered she had inherited nothing but debts. A wagon with 2 broken wheels, and a mule that would sooner kick a man than pull a load. Standing in the scorching Nevada sun outside the land office in Silver Creek on that blistering July afternoon in 1878, she watched the bank representative nail a foreclosure notice to what had been her childhood home. 22 years old, alone in the world, and now without even a roof over her head, Clara felt the weight of her circumstances pressing down harder than the relentless heat. The other townsfolk averted their eyes as they passed, uncomfortable with her sudden poverty, and she knew with grim certainty that respectable employment for a woman in her position would be scarce. Marriage seemed her only option, but what man would want a penniless bride? She had heard through the postmaster's wife that a rancher up in the highlands needed a wife, someone practical who could work alongside him on his cattle spread. The advertisement had been specific about not requiring a dowry, which had given Clara a desperate spark of hope. She had written to him immediately, her penmanship careful and honest, explaining her situation without embellishment. To her amazement, Jack Morrison had written back within 2 weeks, his letter brief but not unkind, saying he would meet her at the crossroads between Silver Creek and his ranch on the 15th of July. He asked only that she be of sound character and willing to work hard, which were perhaps the only 2 things Clara could honestly claim to possess. Now, as she stood beside her pathetic collection of worldly goods, Clara wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The wagon listed dramatically to one side, its broken wheels making it impossible to roll more than a few feet before it threatened to collapse entirely. The mule, a gray beast her father had optimistically named Sergeant, stood with his ears pinned back and his yellowed teeth bared at anyone who dared approach. She had managed to load her few possessions into the wagon bed, a trunk of clothes, her mother's quilt, a cast-iron skillet, and a Bible, but she had no way to transport any of it to the meeting point 5 miles north of town. Problem miss. The voice came from behind her, deep and touched with amusement. Clara turned to find a man watching her from astride a handsome chestnut horse. He was tall even sitting down, with broad shoulders under a dusty blue shirt and a black hat tipped back to reveal sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. He looked to be somewhere near 30, with the lean, capable build of someone who spent his days working cattle. A faint smile played at the corner of his mouth as he took in her situation, but his eyes were kind rather than mocking. "Nothing I cannot handle," Clara said, lifting her chin despite the obvious absurdity of her claim. Sergeant chose that moment to bray loudly and attempt to bite through his lead rope, undermining whatever dignity she had tried to muster. The cowboy dismounted in one smooth motion, moving with the unconscious grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. Up close, Clara could see the fine lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, and a small scar along his jaw that looked like it had come from a hard life honestly lived. He walked past her to examine the wagon, crouching down to inspect the broken wheels with the careful attention of someone who understood such things. "These wheels are not just broken, they are done for," he said, straightening up and dusting off his hands. "You would need a wheelwright and probably 2 days of work to make this wagon roadworthy." He turned his attention to Sergeant, who immediately tried to bite him. The cowboy sidestepped the attempt without apparent concern, studying the mule with a critical eye. "And this fellow looks like he has decided his working days are behind him. He is just particular about who handles him," Clara said defensively, though she knew it was a lie. Sergeant hated everyone with equal enthusiasm. Particular is one word for it. The cowboy's lips twitched with suppressed laughter. "May I ask where you are trying to get to with this outfit?" Clara hesitated, embarrassment flooding through her. She had not expected to encounter anyone who knew the area, and she certainly had not wanted to advertise her desperate circumstances to a stranger. but something in his weathered face suggested he was not the sort to gossip or judge, and she desperately needed help. "The crossroads north of town," she admitted. "I am meant to meet someone there at sundown." "Jack Morrison?" the cowboy asked, and when Clara's eyes widened in surprise, he nodded slowly. "I thought so. I am Jack Morrison, and I take it you are Clara Bennett." The world seemed to tilt slightly beneath Clara's feet. This was the man she had agreed to marry, standing here watching her struggle with the physical evidence of her complete lack of worth as a bride. She waited for the disappointment to cross his face, for him to make some excuse and ride away from this disaster he had accidentally entangled himself in. Instead, Jack Morrison tilted his head and surveyed her broken wagon and hostile mule with the same careful attention he might give to a hand of cards. "So this is your dowry?" he asked, and there was that hint of amusement again, but layered underneath it was something else, something warmer. "I know it is not what you expected," Clara began, hating the defensive note in her voice. "I was honest in my letter about my circumstances, but I understand if you want to reconsider the arrangement. I will not hold you to any promise made before you saw the reality of my situation." Jack walked around the wagon again, then studied Sargent for a long moment. The mule glared back at him with undiminished hostility. Then Jack Morrison did something Clara had not expected at all. He threw back his head and laughed, a genuine sound of delight that rang out across the dusty street and made several passers-by turn to stare. "A broken wagon and a stubborn mule," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That is a fine start." Clara stared at him, certain she had misheard. "A fine start to what exactly? A comedy show?" "To a marriage," Jack said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "My spread is successful because I am good at taking broken things and making them work. I have fixed collapsed barns, healed injured horses, and once I even repaired a pocket watch I found in a stream. A wagon is just wood and metal, and as for the mule, well, every creature is stubborn until you figure out what motivates them." He turned his full attention to Clara then, and she felt the weight of his gaze like physical warmth. "The question is not whether I want to reconsider based on your dowry, Miss Bennett. The question is whether you still want to come with me after meeting the man foolish enough to think he can fix anything." Clara found herself speechless, a rare occurrence. She had prepared herself for rejection, for pity, perhaps even for anger that she had wasted his time. She had not prepared herself for acceptance, much less for this strange man's apparent amusement at her circumstances. "I do not need you to fix me," she said finally, hearing the edge in her own voice. "I am not broken." "No," Jack agreed easily, "you are not. But you do need help getting yourself and your belongings to my ranch, and I am offering it. Unless you would prefer to drag this wagon 5 miles uphill with Sargent's enthusiastic cooperation." Despite herself, Clara felt a smile tugging at her lips. There was something disarming about Jack Morrison's straightforward manner, the way he acknowledged the absurdity of the situation without making her feel small because of it. She had expected a hard man, weathered by ranch work and desperate enough for a wife that he would overlook her poverty. Instead, she found herself looking at someone who seemed genuinely unbothered by her lack of material wealth. "I suppose I could use some assistance," she admitted. "Good." Jack nodded decisively. "First things first, we are going to leave this wagon here for now. I will come back tomorrow with proper tools and some replacement wheels I have in my barn. As for your belongings, we can load them onto my horse and Sargent, assuming we can convince Sargent to cooperate." "He will not let you load him," Clara warned. "He barely lets me near him." "Everything can be negotiated," Jack said calmly. He approached Sargent slowly, not head-on but from an angle, moving with deliberate casualness. The mule's ears swiveled toward him, tracking his movement. Jack did not reach for the mule or try to touch him. Instead, he simply stood nearby, not quite looking at Sargent directly, giving the animal time to assess him. Clara watched in amazement as the tension gradually leaked out of Sargent's posture. The mule did not become friendly exactly, but he stopped actively projecting murderous intent, which was more cooperation than Clara had seen from him in months. Jack waited another full minute, then slowly extended his hand, letting Sargent sniff his fingers. The mule considered, then apparently decided this particular human might be tolerable, at least temporarily. "How did you do that?" Clara asked, genuinely impressed. "Mules are smart, smarter than horses in some ways," Jack explained, his voice low and calm. "They do not trust easily, but once you earn it, they are loyal. Sargent here has probably been pushed around by people who did not understand that you cannot force a mule to do anything. You have to make them think cooperation was their idea all along." He gently ran his hand down Sargent's neck, and the mule actually leaned into the touch slightly. "He is not stubborn, he is just tired of being treated poorly. Are you not, old man?" The compassion in Jack's voice as he spoke to the animal made something twist in Clara's chest. She had spent the last month since her father's death feeling exactly like Sargent, pushed around by circumstances, defensive against a world that seemed hostile, and deeply tired. The fact that Jack Morrison could see past the mule's bad behavior to the hurt beneath it suggested a depth of character she had not expected to find. Together, they loaded Clara's belongings onto Jack's horse and, with surprising cooperation, onto Sargent as well. Jack distributed the weight carefully, making sure nothing would shift or unbalance during the journey. As he worked, he explained that his ranch was about an hour's ride into the highlands, where the grass grew thick and sweet and a creek ran year-round. "It is not fancy," he warned, "but it is solid. I built the house myself 5 years ago when I first claimed the land. 2 rooms for now, though I have been planning to add on. There is a good barn, a chicken coop, and about 50 head of cattle. I run them with help from 2 ranch hands, Miguel and his son Paulo, who have a cabin on the eastern edge of the property. They are good men, hard workers." As they walked, leading the animals out of Silver Creek and onto the dusty trail that wound up into the hills, Clara found herself stealing glances at Jack Morrison. He moved with a confident stride, completely at ease with the silence that stretched between them. She appreciated that he did not feel the need to fill every moment with meaningless chatter, but she also found herself curious about this man she had agreed to marry. "Why did you advertise for a wife?" she asked finally, when they had left the town behind and the landscape had opened up into rolling grassland dotted with juniper and sage. A man with a successful ranch should have no shortage of prospects. Jack was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the horizon. "I suppose I could have courted someone local," he said eventually. "But the truth is, I do not have much talent for pretty words or dancing at socials. I am better with my hands than my mouth, better at showing than telling. The women in the nearby settlements are looking for men who can charm them, and I am not that kind of man." He glanced at her, and there was a vulnerability in his expression that surprised her. "I wanted someone practical, someone who understood that ranch life is hard work and long days. I wanted a partner, not someone who expected to be entertained or kept like a decoration." "And you think I will make a suitable partner based on a few letters?" Clara asked, genuinely curious rather than challenging. "I think your letters showed honesty, which is rarer than you might expect," Jack replied. "You did not try to present yourself as something you are not. You told me your circumstances plainly, including the debts and the lack of prospects. That kind of straightforwardness is worth more to me than a dozen coy flirtations." He paused, then added, "And you are here, walking up a dusty trail with a stranger despite having every reason to be frightened or uncertain. That takes courage." Clara felt heat rising to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. She was not accustomed to being seen so clearly, to having her small acts of bravery recognized and valued. "I am not sure it is courage so much as lack of alternatives." "I think you are selling yourself short," Jack said quietly, "but you will figure that out in time." They walked on as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The trail climbed steadily, and Clara found her legs aching from the exertion, but she refused to complain. Jack maintained an easy pace, occasionally pointing out landmarks or explaining features of the terrain. He showed her where a spring bubbled up near a stand of cottonwoods, where he had once found a mountain lion's den now abandoned, and where the best wild blackberries grew in late summer. "You know this land well," Clara observed. "I have walked every inch of my property and most of the surrounding territory," Jack agreed. "When you depend on the land for your livelihood, you learn to read it like a book. The plants tell you where water runs underground, the animal tracks tell you what threats might be around, the shape of the hills tells you where snow will drift in winter." As he spoke, Clara began to understand that Jack Morrison's connection to this place ran deeper than simple ownership. He spoke of the land with a tenderness that most men reserved for sweethearts, and she found herself envying that certainty of belonging. She had never felt rooted anywhere, not even in Silver Creek where she had been born. Her mother had died when she was young, and her father had been a kind but distant man, more interested in his failed mining ventures than in building a home. When they finally crested a rise, and Jack pointed down into a valley below, Clara caught her breath. The ranch spread out before them in the golden afternoon light, and it was beautiful in a spare, honest way. The house was indeed modest, built of weathered wood with a stone chimney, but it sat in a protected spot with trees on two sides and the creek Jack had mentioned running nearby. The barn was larger than the house, well maintained with a good roof, and she could see cattle grazing in a pasture beyond. Chickens scratched in a fenced yard, and vegetable gardens showed neat rows of growing plants. It looked like what it was, a place built by hard work and careful planning, a place where someone could build a life. "It is not much compared to some of the bigger spreads in the territory," Jack said, and she could hear the uncertainty in his voice, "but it is mine, free and clear. No debts, no obligations to anyone." "It is perfect," Clara said, and meant it. The ranch represented everything she had lost when her father died: security, permanence, the possibility of a future. But more than that, it showed her something about the man she had agreed to marry. This was a place built by someone who planned for the long term, who took care of what was his, who found satisfaction in work well done. They made their way down into the valley as the sun touched the horizon. Two men emerged from a cabin to the east, and Jack raised his hand in greeting. The older man, Miguel, was weathered and lean with silver threading through his black hair. His son Paulo looked to be about Clara's age, with his father's strong build and an easy smile. Both men tipped their hats respectfully to Clara as Jack made introductions. "Miss Bennett will be staying," Jack said simply. "We will be married as soon as we can get the circuit preacher up here." If Miguel or Paulo thought there was anything unusual about this arrangement, neither showed it. Miguel simply nodded and said, "Welcome, miss. If you need anything, you have only to ask." After the ranch hands returned to their own cabin for the evening, Jack showed Clara into the house. The interior was as straightforward as the exterior, clean and functional without much decoration. The main room held a table with 4 chairs, a wood stove for cooking, shelves with neatly organized supplies, and a rocking chair near the fireplace. Through an open door, Clara could see a bedroom with a simple bed frame and trunk. "You will take the bedroom," Jack said, not meeting her eyes. "I will sleep out here until after the wedding. I want you to know that I will not pressure you into anything before it is proper, and even after we are married, I will not force you into anything you are not comfortable with. I need a wife and partner, Clara, not a possession." The way he said her name carefully, as if testing how it felt in his mouth, made something flutter in Clara's chest. She had been braced for many possible scenarios, including the possibility that Jack Morrison would expect certain privileges despite the lack of a formal marriage. The fact that he was offering her privacy and respect, treating her as an autonomous person rather than property acquired through their agreement, made her shoulders relax slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you might know." Jack nodded, then seemed uncertain what to do next, which Clara found endearing. Here was a man completely confident in working with animals and land, but clearly uncomfortable with the domestic intimacy of sharing space with a woman. She took pity on him. "I can make supper," she offered. "If you will show me where things are kept." Relief crossed Jack's face. "I would appreciate that. I am a competent cook in the sense that I can keep myself alive, but I would not claim any talent for it. There is venison in the cold cellar, potatoes, some canned vegetables from last year's garden, flour for biscuits." They worked together in the kitchen area, Jack showing Clara where he kept various supplies, explaining his system for organizing food stores and managing the household. She was impressed by how well-maintained everything was. This was not the home of a slovenly bachelor waiting for a woman to come clean up after him. Jack Morrison clearly took pride in his space and kept it orderly, which suggested he would be a considerate person to live with. As Clara prepared the meal, Jack tended to the animals, bringing Sargent and his horse into the barn for the night. When he returned, he washed up at the basin outside, then sat at the table and watched Clara work with an expression she could not quite decipher. "What?" she asked finally, self-conscious under his steady gaze. "I am just thinking how strange it is to have someone else in this house," Jack said. "I have lived alone for 5 years. It is odd in a good way, I think, but odd nonetheless." Clara could understand that. She too felt the strangeness of this new situation, this sudden shift from one life to another. Just this morning she had woken in her childhood home, alone and facing a frightening future. Now she stood in a stranger's kitchen, preparing supper as if they were already married, as if this were already her home. It should have felt more wrong than it did, but instead there was a rightness to it that she could not quite explain. They ate together as darkness settled over the valley, talking in fits and starts about practical matters. Jack explained the rhythms of ranch life, the daily and seasonal work that would need doing. He made it clear that he expected Clara to be a full partner in the operation, not just a housekeeper. She would need to learn about the cattle, about managing supplies for the harsh winters, about 100 different skills that made the difference between a successful ranch and a failed one. "I am a fast learner," Clara assured him. "I may not know much about ranching yet, but I am not afraid of hard work." "I can see that," Jack said, and there was approval in his voice that made Clara sit a little straighter. After supper, as Clara cleaned the dishes and Jack banked the fire in the stove, an awkward silence fell between them. They were two strangers about to spend the night under the same roof, bound by an agreement but not yet by any deeper connection. Clara found herself intensely aware of Jack's presence, the way he moved through the space, the sound of his breathing, the masculine scent of leather and horses and sun-warmed skin. "I will bid you good night then," Jack said finally, lingering near the bedroom door. "If you need anything, I will be right out here." "Good night, Jack," Clara replied and slipped into the bedroom, closing the door behind her. She lay awake for a long time in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Somewhere outside, an owl called. The creek murmured over stones. In the main room, she could hear Jack moving quietly, preparing his makeshift bed. Clara thought about the turn her life had taken in just one day, how she had gone from destitute and hopeless to lying in a comfortable bed in a solid house with a future opening up before her. More than that, she thought about Jack Morrison himself. He was not what she had expected, which was perhaps naive on her part since she had built him up in her imagination based on brief letters. She had pictured someone harder, more weathered by loneliness, perhaps bitter or desperate. Instead, she had found a man who laughed at broken wagons and stubborn mules, who was gentle with animals and respectful with people, who had built something solid and good through his own labor. Clara was practical enough to know that attraction and affection were different from the foundation of a successful marriage. They would need to learn each other's habits and temperaments, would need to navigate the intimate challenges of building a shared life. But lying there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of her new home, Clara felt something she had not felt in months: hope. The next morning, Clara woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of Jack moving around the main room. She dressed quickly in one of her simple work dresses, braided her hair, and emerged to find Jack setting out a breakfast of fried eggs and thick slices of bread. "I let you sleep," he said. "You looked exhausted last night, and I figured you have had a difficult few weeks." "Thank you," Clara said, touched by his consideration. "But I do not want you to feel you need to coddle me. I am here to work." "All the same, there is no harm in easing into things," Jack replied. He poured her coffee, and they sat together at the table as the morning light strengthened outside. After breakfast, Jack took Clara on a proper tour of the property, showing her the barn where he kept his horses and equipment, explaining his plans for expansion, pointing out where he hoped to add more cattle in the coming year. Miguel and Paulo joined them for part of the tour, and Clara appreciated how Jack clearly valued their input and treated them as partners in the operation rather than just hired help. "We work together here," Jack explained when the two men had gone back to their tasks. "I could not run this place without Miguel's experience or Paulo's strong back. They share in the profits when we sell cattle, and they have security as long as I have this ranch. It is a better arrangement than most hired hands get, but they earn every penny." Clara was impressed by Jack's fairness, which seemed to extend to all aspects of how he ran his operation. She had known ranchers and business owners in Silver Creek who squeezed every advantage they could from the people who worked for them. But Jack seemed to operate on a principle of mutual benefit that was both unusual and admirable. Over the following days, Clara threw herself into learning everything she could about ranch life. Jack was a patient teacher, showing her how to read the cattle's behavior to spot illness or injury, how to preserve food for the winter, how to maintain equipment so it lasted. She learned to milk the cow, to collect eggs without getting pecked, to identify which plants were useful for medicine or food and which were poisonous. The work was harder than anything Clara had done before, leaving her exhausted at the end of each day, but it was also satisfying in a way her previous life had never been. There was a directness to ranch work, a clear connection between effort and result that appealed to her practical nature. When she mended a fence, she could see it standing straight and strong. When she weeded the garden, she could watch the vegetables thrive. Everything she did mattered, contributed to the success of the whole operation. Through it all, she and Jack circled each other carefully, learning each other's rhythms. Jack rose before dawn every day, starting with chores before breakfast. He worked steadily through the day without complaint, but he also knew when to rest, sitting on the porch in the evening to watch the sunset with a calm appreciation that Clara found peaceful. He was not much of a talker, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and usually worth hearing. Clara discovered that Jack had a dry sense of humor that emerged at unexpected moments. Once when Sargent tried to kick him while he was cleaning the mule's hooves, Jack simply stepped aside and said conversationally, "You know, I am trying to help you, but if you would rather have sore feet, I can respect that choice." The mule had seemed almost offended by this logic and stood still for the rest of the process. 2 weeks after Clara's arrival, the circuit preacher made his scheduled rounds to the Highland ranches. Reverend Patterson was an elderly man with kind eyes and a wealth of experience, marrying frontier couples in less than ideal circumstances. He asked Jack and Clara each privately if they were entering the marriage freely, which Clara appreciated even though the question felt somewhat absurd given her situation. Still, she could honestly say yes. Whatever pressures had brought her to this point, Jack Morrison himself had never pressured her, and she was choosing this future with her eyes open. They were married on a Sunday afternoon with Miguel and Paulo as witnesses, standing in front of the house with the mountains rising behind them and the creek providing soft music. Clara wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, and Jack had clearly made an effort with his appearance, his hair neatly combed and his shirt freshly pressed. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife and Jack leaned in to kiss her, it was chaste and brief, but Clara felt the warmth of his lips and the gentle way his hand cupped her cheek, and something shifted in her chest. They had a modest celebration afterward, sharing a meal with Miguel, Paulo, and the Reverend before the old preacher rode on to his next stop. After everyone had left and the sun was setting, Jack and Clara found themselves alone together as husband and wife, and the atmosphere between them changed, becoming charged with possibility and nervousness. "I want you to know," Jack said carefully, standing near the bedroom door, "that nothing has to change tonight unless you want it to. I meant what I said about not forcing anything." Clara appreciated his consideration, but she also recognized that they were married now, and at some point they would need to make this marriage real in all ways. More than that, she found that she wanted to bridge the gap between them, to move beyond this careful politeness into something more genuine. "I am your wife now," she said quietly, "and I think we should try to be married in truth, not just in law." Jack's eyes searched her face, making sure she meant it. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded slowly and held out his hand. Clara took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers, and let him lead her into the bedroom. What passed between them that night was tender and awkward in equal measure. Two people learning each other's bodies and preferences with more good intentions than expertise. But there was kindness in Jack's touch, patience in how he let Clara set the pace, and genuine care in how he held her afterward. Clara, lying in her husband's arms as his breathing deepened into sleep, felt something warm taking root in her chest that might, given time and nurturing, grow into love. The weeks that followed their wedding settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. Clara threw herself into the work of the ranch with determination, proving herself capable and reliable. Jack responded by trusting her with more responsibilities, teaching her to ride well enough that she could help move the cattle, showing her how to handle a rifle for protection against predators, involving her in decisions about the ranch's future. But beyond the practical partnership, something else was growing between them. Clara caught herself watching Jack as he worked, admiring the capable way he handled challenges, the gentleness he showed to animals and people alike, the quiet integrity that governed all his actions. She noticed small kindnesses he did for her, like bringing wildflowers to place on the table, or making sure her favorite coffee was never in short supply, or fixing the rocking chair so it did not squeak because he knew it annoyed her. For his part, Jack seemed increasingly comfortable with Clara's presence, his initial awkwardness giving way to an easiness that spoke of genuine affection. He started seeking out her company in the evenings, sitting beside her on the porch to watch the stars emerge, sharing stories from his past that he had not mentioned before. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about losing his parents to cholera, about drifting west and finding this valley, and knowing with bone-deep certainty that this was where he was meant to build his life. One evening in late August, as they sat together watching lightning flicker on the distant horizon, Jack reached over and took Clara's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. It was such a simple gesture, but it made Clara's heart accelerate because it was the first time Jack had initiated physical contact outside of their bedroom, the first time he had reached for her simply because he wanted to be close to her. "I have been thinking," Jack said quietly, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand, "about how lucky I am that you answered my advertisement. I know you came here out of necessity, but I hope you are not entirely miserable being stuck with me." Clara turned to look at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. In the fading light, she could see the uncertainty in his expression, as if he genuinely worried that she might regret their arrangement. "Jack Morrison," she said firmly, squeezing his hand, "I am not stuck with you. I am choosing you every day more fully than I did when I first agreed to come here." "Are you?" Jack asked, and there was such hope in his voice that Clara felt her eyes sting with unexpected tears. "Yes," she said simply. "I came here expecting a business arrangement, a marriage of convenience. But you have been kind and patient and respectful, and you have made me feel valued in a way I never experienced before. I do not know if you can understand what that means to someone who spent most of her life feeling like a burden." Jack was quiet for a long moment, then he shifted closer, releasing her hand only to wrap his arm around her shoulders and pull her against his side. Clara settled against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart, and knew with sudden clarity that what she felt for him had grown far beyond practical appreciation or grateful affection. "I think I am falling in love with you," she whispered into the gathering darkness. She felt Jack's entire body go still. Then he turned to look down at her, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that stole her breath. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I have been in love with you for weeks. I just did not want to burden you with it when I knew you had married me for security, not for romance. I thought if I was patient, if I gave you space, maybe eventually you would grow to care for me a little. But if you are saying what I think you are saying—" "I am saying that I love you," Clara interrupted, needing him to hear it clearly. "I am saying that this has become so much more than I ever expected. I am saying that when I think about the future now, you are the center of it, not just the circumstances you provide." Jack kissed her then, not chaste or brief like their wedding kiss, but deep and passionate and full of all the feelings they had been carefully containing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jack rested his forehead against hers and laughed softly. "A broken wagon and a stubborn mule," he murmured. "That really was a fine start." Clara laughed too, giddy with joy and relief and the overwhelming rightness of being exactly where she was meant to be. "The best start," she agreed and kissed him again. The seasons turned, and Clara watched her first autumn in the highlands paint the aspens gold and bring the cattle down from the high pastures. She and Jack worked side by side through the busy time of preparing for winter, putting up food and making sure all the buildings were sound and tight against the coming cold. The work was exhausting but satisfying, made lighter by the deepening bond between them. Clara discovered that marriage to Jack Morrison was an adventure in small joys and quiet moments. He taught her to dance one evening when snow began to fall, humming a tune while they moved around the main room, laughing when they bumped into furniture. She taught him to play cards, and they spent many winter evenings engaged in cutthroat games of poker that Jack pretended to lose more often than she suspected, was strictly honest. They learned each other's histories in greater depth, the stories that shaped who they had become. Jack told her about his time working as a ranch hand on other people's spreads, saving every penny until he had enough to claim his own land. Clara told him about her mother's death and her father's slow decline into financial ruin, about the loneliness of being the only child of a man too lost in his own failures to truly see her. "I used to think there was something wrong with me," Clara admitted one night as they lay together in their bed, Jack's arms wrapped around her, "that I was unworthy of being truly seen or loved." "There is nothing wrong with you," Jack said fiercely, tightening his hold. "You are the strongest, most capable, most beautiful woman I have ever known. Anyone who did not see that was a fool." By the time spring returned to the valley, Clara could no longer imagine her life before Jack. The woman who had stood in Silver Creek watching her world collapse felt like a stranger, someone from a distant past. This was her real life, here in this valley with this man, building something that mattered. In April, Clara realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not wanted to say anything until she was certain. When she finally told Jack over breakfast one morning, watching his face carefully for his reaction, she saw his expression transform from surprise to wonder to pure joy. A baby. He said, as if he needed to confirm he had heard correctly. "We are going to have a baby, in late autumn, I think," Clara said, and then found herself swept up in Jack's arms as he stood and spun her around, both of them laughing. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Jack was simultaneously protective and determined not to treat Clara like she was fragile. He adjusted her workload to be less physically demanding, but still trusted her to be involved in running the ranch. Miguel's wife Rosa, who lived in a town down in the valley and visited occasionally, became a valuable source of advice and support, having birthed 6 children of her own. As Clara's belly grew round with their child, she and Jack spent evenings planning for the future. They discussed the addition they would build onto the house, adding 2 more rooms for children and expanding the main living space. They talked about teaching their children to love this land as Jack did, about building something that would last beyond their own lives. "I want our children to know they are loved," Clara said one evening, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "I want them to grow up feeling secure and valued, never doubting their place in this family." "They will," Jack promised, his hand covering hers, feeling for the movements of the baby inside. "Between the 2 of us, they will have more love than they know what to do with." In October, as the leaves turned color again and the first hints of winter appeared in the morning air, Clara went into labor. Rosa had come to stay at the ranch for the event, and she proved invaluable as Clara worked through the long hours of bringing new life into the world. Jack paced outside, occasionally coming to the door to ask anxiously if everything was all right, until Rosa finally took pity on him and let him in to hold Clara's hand through the final pushes. Their son was born just after midnight, small and red-faced and perfect. Jack held him with trembling hands, staring down at the baby as if he could not quite believe this tiny person was real. When he looked up at Clara, his eyes were bright with tears. "He is perfect," Jack whispered. "You are perfect. I do not have words for what I feel right now." "Neither do I," Clara said, exhausted and euphoric and more completely happy than she had ever imagined possible. "But I think it might be called joy." They named him Thomas after Jack's father, and he was a healthy, robust baby who quickly became the center of their world. Jack proved to be a devoted father, involved in Thomas's care in a way that was unusual for men of the time. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with the baby when Thomas was fussy, and sang off-key lullabies that somehow always worked to calm their son. The ranch continued to prosper as the years passed. Jack's careful management and hard work paid off in steady growth, and they were able to expand their operations gradually. They added more cattle, improved their facilities, and built the addition to the house they had planned. Miguel and Paulo remained valued partners in the operation, and the relationship between the families deepened into genuine friendship. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious child who toddled after his father from the moment he could walk, wanting to be involved in everything Jack did. Clara watched her husband teach their son with the same patience he had shown her, explaining how the ranch worked, why they did things certain ways, the importance of treating animals and people with respect. When Thomas was 2, Clara became pregnant again, and their daughter was born the following spring. They named her Rose, and she had Clara's dark hair and Jack's watercolored eyes. Where Thomas was bold and active, Rose was more thoughtful and gentle, and Jack doted on her with complete abandon. Clara teased him about being wrapped around their daughter's tiny finger, but she loved watching her strong, capable husband turn soft with tenderness when he held Rose. As their children grew, Clara sometimes thought back to that desperate day in Silver Creek, standing beside a broken wagon and hostile mule, convinced her life was over. She thought about how close she had come to a very different future, how a few small changes might have meant she never met Jack Morrison at all. The idea was enough to make her hold her family a little tighter, appreciate the miracle of ordinary happiness a little more fully. One evening, when Thomas was 5 and Rose was 3, Clara and Jack sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard. Thomas was teaching Rose to feed the chickens, showing her with elaborate seriousness how to scatter the grain. Jack's arm was around Clara's shoulders, and she leaned into him with the comfortable ease of long affection. "Do you ever regret it?" Jack asked suddenly, his voice thoughtful. "Marrying me, coming here, giving up whatever other life you might have had?" Clara turned to look at him, surprised by the question. "Jack Morrison, how can you ask me that? Look at our life, look at our children. I have never regretted a single moment of being your wife." "I know," Jack said, smiling a little, "but sometimes I still cannot quite believe my luck. That you answered my advertisement, that you were willing to take a chance on a rough cowboy with more ambition than sense. That a broken wagon and stubborn mule led me to the love of my life." Clara felt her eyes fill with tears, the happy kind that came from overwhelming emotion. After 7 years of marriage, Jack could still surprise her with the depth of his feelings, still make her heart race with simple declarations of love. "That mule was a trial," she said, trying for lightness even as her voice wavered. "Sargent hated everyone except you." "Sargent had good taste," Jack replied, kissing her temple. "He recognized that I was someone worth tolerating, and he brought me you. I am eternally grateful to that bad-tempered animal." As if summoned by their conversation, Sargent chose that moment to bray loudly from his pasture. The old mule was still with them, too ornery to die, though he had long since retired from anything resembling work. He lived out his days in comfortable semi-hostility, allowing only Jack and occasionally Clara to approach him, terrorizing everyone else with equal enthusiasm. "Do you think he knows we are talking about him?" Clara asked, laughing. "Probably. Mules are smart." Jack stood, pulling Clara up with him. "Come on, let us go check on the children before Thomas decides Rose needs to learn to ride the chickens or some other creative disaster." They walked down into the yard together, and Clara watched Jack scoop up Rose while she squealed with delight, watched Thomas run to grab his father's free hand, and felt her heart so full it almost hurt. This life they had built together, this family they had created, was everything she had never known she wanted. That night, after the children were asleep and she and Jack lay together in their bed, Clara traced idle patterns on Jack's chest and thought about the journey that had brought her here. All the hardship and loss that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of her real life. The broken wagon had been fixed and now sat in their barn, used for hauling supplies. Sargent had mellowed with age, as much as he was capable of mellowing. And she had found in Jack Morrison not just security or partnership, but a love that transformed everything it touched. "What are you thinking about?" Jack murmured sleepily, his hand moving in slow circles on her back. "Just that you were right," Clara said softly. "That first day when you saw my dowry and laughed. It really was a fine start." "The finest," Jack agreed, and kissed her one more time before they drifted off to sleep, secure in the life they had built and the future they would face together. The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growing of their children. Thomas became a skilled horseman, eager to learn everything about running the ranch from his father. Rose developed a gift for growing things, taking over the vegetable gardens and expanding them until they produced far more than the family could use. She started selling her excess produce to nearby ranches and down in the valley towns, developing a small but profitable business of her own. Jack and Clara watched their children flourish with deep satisfaction, knowing they had given Thomas and Rose something precious. A stable home filled with love and the knowledge that they belonged somewhere absolutely. The ranch continued to grow modestly, never becoming one of the huge cattle empires that were starting to dominate parts of the West, but remaining successful enough to provide security and comfort for their family and the families who worked with them. Miguel and Paulo remained integral parts of their operation, and when Paulo married a woman from Silver Creek, they built him and his new wife a proper house on the property. The ranch was becoming something more than just one family's livelihood. It was a community of people who cared for each other and the land they shared when Thomas was 15 and Rose was 13. Clara became pregnant once more, surprising both her and Jack. They had assumed their family was complete, but the arrival of another son, whom they named Samuel, felt like an unexpected gift. Thomas and Rose doted on their baby brother, and Jack joked that he was going to be impossibly spoiled with so many people competing to hold him. As Clara held Samuel and watched Jack playing with Thomas and Rose in the evening light, she was struck by the richness of the life they had created. She was 42 years old, the mother of 3 children, the co-owner of a successful ranch, and the wife of a man who still looked at her with love and desire after nearly 2 decades of marriage. The girl who had stood beside a broken wagon, convinced she had nothing to offer, had been so wrong about herself. The final thing that needed fixing from Clara's old life resolved itself in an unexpected way. One day, a traveling merchant stopped at the ranch and mentioned that the town of Silver Creek was mostly abandoned now, the silver deposits having played out and most residents having moved on to more promising locations. Jack and Clara made the trip down to see for themselves and found the merchant had been right. The town was largely empty, buildings boarded up, the land office closed. They found Clara's father's old house, weathered and empty, and the broken wagon that had started everything, still sitting where they had left it all those years ago. The wood was grayed by sun and weather, one wheel completely detached now, but seeing it brought back a flood of memories. "Should we take it?" Jack asked, gesturing at the wagon. "Fix it up for Thomas to use?" Clara looked at the derelict wagon, then at her husband, and shook her head. "No," she said. "Let it stay here. It served its purpose." "What purpose was that?" Jack asked, sliding his arm around her waist. "Bringing me to you," Clara said simply, leaning into him. "Giving us our fine start." They rode back to the ranch as the sun set, leaving the ghost town behind them. Silver Creek had never been Clara's real home. This valley, this ranch, this family was where she had always been meant to be. Sometimes the broken things in life did not need to be fixed. Sometimes they just needed to lead you to where you belonged. As the years rolled into decades, Jack and Clara grew old together, watching their children become adults and start families of their own. Thomas took over running the ranch with his father, then eventually without him as Jack's body began to slow with age. Rose married a farmer from down in the valley and moved to her own place, though she visited often with her growing brood of children. Samuel, their surprise baby, showed a talent for numbers and business that led him to help manage the financial side of the ranch's operations. On their 40th wedding anniversary, Jack and Clara sat on the porch of the house they had expanded and improved over the decades, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Jack's hair was white now, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were still the same creekwater gray, still looking at Clara with the same love that had grown from those early days of careful partnership into something deep and unshakable. 40 years, Clara said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like 40 minutes, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together. I prefer the second feeling, Jack said, his hand finding hers automatically, fingers interlacing with the practiced ease of thousands of repetitions. I cannot remember what it was like before you, and I do not want to. Me either, Clara agreed. She looked out at the land they had worked together, at the family they had created, at the life they had built from almost nothing. We did well, didn't we? We did, Jack said softly. Starting from a broken wagon and stubborn mule, we built something that will last long after we are gone. Not bad for a desperate advertisement and an answered letter. Clara laughed, the sound carrying across the yard and making several grandchildren look up and smile. Even in her 70s, she could still find joy in remembering those early days, the uncertainty and fear that had eventually transformed into love and belonging. I am grateful, she said, squeezing Jack's hand. For all of it, the hard parts and the easy parts, the struggles and the triumphs. Every single day that led us here. Me too, Jack said, and kissed her with the tender familiarity of 4 decades of marriage. Every single day. They sat together as the sun set over the valley, surrounded by the family and life they had created, and knew with absolute certainty that they had found what everyone searches for: a place to belong and someone to belong with. The broken wagon was long gone, rotted away in an abandoned town. Sargent had died years ago, ornery until the very end. But what they had started together endured, written into the land and the family and the love that had grown from the most unpromising beginning into something beautiful and lasting. As darkness settled and their grandchildren were called inside by their parents, Jack and Clara remained on the porch a little longer, holding hands and watching the stars emerge. They had grown old together, worked together, raised children and grandchildren together, and loved each other through all the seasons of a long life. Starting from nothing but determination and hope, they had built everything that mattered. It really had been a fine start.